Laura. Hi, everyone. I could easily spend 15 minutes just talking about the questions in the chat. They're so great. So, for those that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, my name's Anna Stavrianakis. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, and I've spent the 20 years of my career so far researching the global arms trade and civil society activism, trying to rein it in. So, I'm really I am pleased and happy to be here. I'm not pleased and I'm not happy about the international and national context in which we're having this meeting. I've given these rather strange title of what do we study and why do we study it as a means to help us think about the question of who needs to think about militarism. And I'm going to talk about higher education specifically because it's the area where I work, it's the sector I know best. Ginsella and Sam have done a brilliant job of talking about the dynamics of the global arms trade and UK university enmeshment with it. So we're listening to them, thinking about this question of who needs to think about the politics of militarism and education. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is that we need to think about what militarism actually is and means, because sometimes we sort of just bandy words about and we're not often specific about what we mean by them. Other times we think the urgency is so pressing that it's just obvious what we mean, but sometimes we can be talking at cross purposes. So the sort of rather academic definition that I use of militarism is the social relations and the international relations of the preparation for and conduct of organized political violence. So it's things that happen domestically, but also things that happen internationally that facilitate and generate and allow the use of organized force, which means that it's not just about glorification. It can be about glorification, but it's also the institutions, the practices, the funding, and so on that makes the use of force possible and legitimizes it in society. And I think that's why it's so interesting that we look at the connections between the military, the arms industry, and universities. To be anti-militarist, in my view, requires making political judgments about the use of force. So I don't see anti-militarism as synonymous with pacifism, although I take pacifism very seriously as a political position. The main reason that I don't see them as synonymous is that I think that it is possible to have an anti-militarist form of armed resistance, and that I don't think we would have had decolonization without armed resistance. But I also think that the use of force, the use of armed resistance always carries with it risks of escalation and these terms we know, like the fog of war, the friction of war, that force can become escalatory. So I don't say those things blithely, but I say them to try and sort of clear some ground. And so if we're thinking about these broader questions of organized political violence, what enables it? What helps it happen? What sustains it and legitimizes it in society? I think there are three things that I'd like to say in this intervention. So the first thing is that I think it's fairly evident from what Ginsella and Sam have told us that some of the people who need to think and talk about militarism and ask questions about what we study and why we study it are engineers and scientists. And that's why I think it's so great that SGR are hosting this conversation. And I'd be interested to know, maybe from our audience, how many of us are engineers and scientists. I am a social scientist by background and training. I'd be interested to know what everyday conversations people are having about these issues in their workplaces or their places of study. So demilitarized education, it's been mentioned a couple of times, have this report. Sorry, if you can hear banging, it's because somebody's cleaning my windows. I'm so sorry. On the hottest day of the year. Demilitarized education have a report that only a minority of students are ideologically committed to working in the arms industry per se. Most of them, most engineering and science students, just want jobs at the end of their degree. Some of them would actively prefer to work in renewables or in another form of more socially useful production. Much of that report resonates with what we know from the scholarship on the practice and the history of people working in the arms or so-called defence sector. So we know from the scholarship that, again, only some people who work in the arms or military industry, only some of them have strong defence or national security related reasons to work in that sector. Only some of them sort of actively believe that they want to make weapons and they want to make them for national security and they want to make them for national defence. For most of them, it's just the job. And that if you are an engineer, if you are a scientist, these are the routes that are often open to you. And what we know is that within arms producing companies, often the specific tasks that people do, the specific roles that people have, the specific things that they work on are kept discrete from each other. You're only ever working on one bit of the process. So nobody thinks that it's them being the one making the weapons. I'm not the one. I didn't make the weapon, because what I do is I research this, or my technical job is to make sure that this thing is safe, or my job is to make this part. Often, scientists and engineers working for arms companies draw a distinction between weapons for national defense, which they believe in, and weapons for human rights abusers over there who, they probably ought not to get them, but that's for the government to decide. And I think some of this resonates with some of the questions in the chat about how to respond to Russia. For some, a small minority, they actively want to work to transition away from military production. And Ken Regalia, our next speaker, has done some amazing work with rank and file trade unionists who are interested in converting military production towards climate production for climate justice. In my experience at both the University of Sussex, where I now work, and at the University of Bristol, where I was a PhD student, it's very hard to engage science and engineering colleagues or students on the questions of who is paying for their research, what are the ends to which their research and teaching are being put, how should university engineering courses relate to industry. I'm not making a blanket statement about all engineers and scientists. I'm just saying that from my experience, engineers and scientists tend to be less politicized about these questions than arts or social science colleagues and students. So far, so good. This is where I want to broaden out the conversation, because I don't think that lets us social scientists or us arts folks off the hook. So the second set of people that I think need to talk about militarism are arts and social sciences people. The social sciences have a history of growing up alongside state interests. Geography, the disciplines of geography and anthropology emerged as the handmaidens of colonialism, mapping and getting to know the populations that European states wanted to colonize. In my own discipline, international relations, one of the first leading journals in the discipline was called the Journal of Race Relations. At least they were explicit about it then. Today, we may not have a journal called the Journal of Race Relations, but much, not all, but much of international relations serves the interests of the state in naturalizing militarism, naturalizing the use of force, naturalizing the preparation for war, especially the closer to practice and policy that it gets. So in the scholarship on UK foreign policy, for example, most of it takes at face value the statements that the UK state makes about its normative commitment to a rules-based international order. And this is in light of UK support for the war, Israel's war on Gaza, support for Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen, and so on. Which, I mean, I think there's something very interesting happening in the social sciences where that can happen, because I just don't see it. I don't see how you can, with a straight face, make the claim or support the claim that the UK is committed to a rules-based international order off the back of its support for those two wars. And to my mind, that shouldn't be a controversial statement. The problem is, as soon as you engage with mainstream scholarship, as soon as you engage with policy and practice, and certainly that you realize how different the world looks from those other places. So Self-identified critical scholars often avoid engaging with policymakers because the terms are set by the state. Those that do want to engage are either ignored or go along with that framing. So to give you an example, I was at an event last week of scholars, policymakers, and civil society actors about UK national security strategy. There were several academics there. I was the only academic to question the wisdom of the UK government's increase in military spending. And when I said that my practical solutions were to decrease military spending, increase spending on aid and development, and to stop arming Saudi Arabia and Israel, the response was, wow, that is really controversial. And so my position as an academic is, why is that seen as controversial? Why can't we have that conversation? I have a colleague at Sussex, David Wearing, who has done a tally of the number of times that Yemen and Gaza appeared in the title or abstract of conference panels at our flagship annual conference, compared to the mention of the word Ukraine. Ukraine appears 10 times as often as the term Yemen or Gaza. So there is just an ignoring of instances where the UK state has been involved in egregious violations of international law, and a massive attention to where the UK is seen as supporting the good guys. But again, higher education is not a monolithic space. I'll point you to the alternative example of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, who declared in August 2025 that Israel's policies and actions in Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide. So some groups of scholars find it perfectly easy, not easy, but they find it perfectly acceptable to look at the evidence, look at the history, look at the terminology, and come to that conclusion, which has not been possible in other spaces. And so this brings me to my third and final point, which is to think about universities as a civic space, as some kind of third space, and what academic duty involves. So universities are, on the one hand, technically autonomous from both state interests and business interests. So we are not funded by the state, we're not primarily funded by industry. We have this position as kind of a third sector type of institution. But universities are not insulated from these demands. So universities, for example, are regulated by the Office for Students, which is a non-departmental public body. It's accountable to Parliament and crucially receives guidance on strategic priorities from the Department of Education. Industry is a source of income and a source of jobs for our students. Demands for employability and for skills for the workplace are now explicit in our curricula. So we have to think about the political economy of higher education, which is that the university sector has been starved of funds from the state with the decline of the funding of higher education from general taxation. We are reliant on student tuition fees, which then sort of doubly exploits our students as we make them pay for this increasingly rubbish form of education. And we're reliant on grants from external bodies. So I think within that context, there are different types of scholarship that we can engage in. And this is where I'm interested to think about what our civic duty is as scholars, because I absolutely don't mean that everybody working in the university sector needs to be massively left-wing and has to agree with me about everything I say about militarism. I think it's perfectly acceptable for some types of scholarship to be pro-state, for some to be actively critical of the state, to some to just pay no attention to the state. That would be what a vibrant civic space do. But what I think the contrast between the wars in Ukraine and Gaza has shown us is that universities are not neutral in any way about war and about militarism. So with Ukraine, we've seen the Ukrainian flag be raised at universities. We've seen scholarships for Ukrainian students. We've seen criticism of Russia. Contrast that to Gaza, where there's been a clampdown on student protest. There's been lots of talk about balance and that you have to talk about what happened on October the 7th before you're allowed to say about anything about the occupation, apartheid, and genocidal war on Palestinians. At the same time, Gaza has contestation over and resistance to state practice in relation to Gaza has brought to light more information about universities' pensions and investment holdings. And so we now have, as I think Jensela already mentioned, a series of much more progressive, socially responsible investment practices, which, again, if people want to, we can talk about in the Q&A. So I think, and I'll close with this, I think it's incumbent on us as academics, as students, as people who have been the beneficiaries of a university education, to think about what our job is as students and as researchers. And I think I would sum it up by saying that our job is to ask questions that are critical of the operation of power. And given all the talk of war, the material increases in military spending, the clear steer from government towards the need to prepare the population for a turn to war, we have work to do. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you